I know that, let's see, we've got Ron Bano has a question and then Susan has a question. So Ron, do you want to go first?
Sure, let me just make a quick comment about that because both speakers had very good information that we're picking up on. But I do have a question for Rodney. Rodney, you were mentioning about the number of different groups and organizations that you're working with. My question is, what's the character of these groups that have come to you? Do they already know what they want and they're just coming to you for expertise? Or do they find out about you and they have no idea what's happening, but they want to get some perspective of it? What's the degree of awareness and knowledge that they have when they come to you to work?
Yeah, I think it's kind of varied, but if I put the folks that are coming to us into categories, I'd say, if we're thinking about cities, we're often going to them either through competitive bids or through responding to RFIs or through word of mouth for other cities that we're working with. And that's in regard to, knowing how to digest data and really provide insights. I think in the conversations we've been having more recently, which is really around this digital communication piece, I think, we're reaching out to a lot of these folks, especially people who are mobility operators that maybe we already work with to get some of their bike and scooter data, but also Google Maps, Apple Maps, right? Those mapping platforms. I think when we talk to them, they understand there's a problem. It's usually just that it's too much of a headache to try to solve it. And I think a lot of that has to just do with coordination among cities. And I think that's where we can play a really good role as we're already working with a lot of cities. We've built those relationships. We can convene them together to figure out, what are your pain points? Is this a technology issue? It is a little bit, or is it a process issue? Everything's basically always a process issue, right? Who is authorized to make changes to your street? Is it your Department of Public Works, your Department of Transportation, some utility providers, your police department? The answer is typically all of the above. And then how does that process work? Who's informed? How is it logged? I think that's where we found some really interesting things, right? So if you're a utility provider, you will apply for a permit to, dig up a road. So there's going to be some road work and you're going to reduce that either parking lane or travel lane. And you want to communicate that out. But often what we see is those permits are issued for periods of time that span days. And the actual work is happening maybe not within that entire time span. So really trying to figure out how can we more accurately communicate those changes that maybe the city's already logging somewhere. And then as always, how do you connect into those systems so that you're not, creating duplicative work?
Good. Thank you.
Susan, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Thank you to Rodney and Robert for your great presentations. Robert, have a few questions for you. Love this research. Congratulations on it. I wanted to ask you a follow-up because I wasn't quite sure. How are you defining social equity in the context of this project? And I guess what the underlying question I'm getting at is how broadly are you looking at it?
Yeah, for the project, we're really defining it as looking at outcomes, and if there's disparity in outcomes, what part of that disparity can be attributed to transportation? So let's say health outcomes. Maybe some health outcome is missing medical appointments. Now, how much of those missed medical appointments are due to transportation reasons? And then are there various disparities among various groups as it relates to transportation access to medical appointments? It's sort of how we're trying to look at it, as sort of backing out from the outcomes, which is really hard to do because the evidence is hard to put together, but that's conceptually.
Yeah, because I was trying to get a handle on if you were focusing primarily on like a low income focus or much more broadly. So
yeah, so mainly low income, and then rural urban were the initial distinctions that we're we're working on is so income based and then rural urban.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really liked your comments earlier about the importance of addressing, I think what you're getting at, housing affordability, because I just am increasingly getting to this point with my own work and my own thinking that if we don't address this issue, it's almost like we're putting a Band-Aid on transportation strategies. Because if people are really far away from where they work, it's always going to be a tough road. And no matter how much technology or crazy good data, Rodney, you throw at it, right? It's still not going to fix the problem. And so I really liked your comment about broadening the stakeholder group to include more of, I guess, stakeholders that have influence over land use. You know, because I feel like we're never going to quite solve any of this until we get at sort of this underlying problem that's causing a lot of these disparities.
Yeah, speaking of housing, so like, for example, during COVID CARES Act, a lot of cities have put like, say, eviction moratoriums, right? So that's one, like housing and housing finance. There's a lot of political capital there. And I think that those who have lost other things, access to transportation, don't have this sort of insurance either or backstop. So do you still have to make for cars, you have to make a car payment, but what now you can't ride the bus, or maybe the bus schedule is cut back. There's no redress for that. Like housing, there seemed to be some redress during this time, but not for moving around. And so I guess my point is just how can we bring more people together? Even at the Federal Reserve, so we're talking to them, but they're PPP loans, all those loans, and that are some of those people who were laid off. How many of them can get to work or not? And maybe those were laid off because they couldn't get to work properly. And so those PPP loans now are public, and we know who got them, and it'd be interesting to map where they are and what their accessibility and transit access were, and wondering if there's a connection there. So
that's a cool idea. Follow up when you want to try to do that.
So
yeah. Yeah, but congratulations on your work, and great presentation from both of you. Thanks so much.
Let's see. We've got a question from Matt, who has his hand up, and then we had a few in the chat pod as well. But Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hey, Robert and Rodney, good to at least hear you. I just had a question more on the logistics side for the data, for both the work you're doing, Robert, and Rodney, the new company that you're working for. In terms of the freedom of information laws and privacy laws, I mean, what type of agreements do you have in place, or where's the data stored, and who has access to what, especially as we move into this path of MaaS and mobility as a service, and more of these public and private partnerships, and the contact tracing, and the possibility for a lot of the apps and the data platforms to be used on a quicker timeline than we probably ever anticipated post-COVID. We never really changed the freedom of information laws, and they're still there. So how does your company and Robert, how does the universities work with your partners? Allow for proper sharing of information in terms of privacy, or even reducing the sharing of trade secrets and people for putting in a FOIL request like a reporter to get access to all the data, or do you not care about that and you just want it all open source?
I guess I go first. So we're going to buy some data from Populous. So there we go. We're going to buy data from like Streetlight, but with cities, we've just been doing individual MOUs. It's super manual and tedious. we have the capability to stand up with data safe havens, but I think there's so many efforts around the nation to get these third-party safe havens up and running, but we've been just trying to do them one-off until there's a clearinghouse. Maybe Rodney has a better feeling for that.
Yeah, I mean, I know, Matt, this is a space that you are well aware of and have been following for a long time. And I think both of us have thought a lot about how, in particular, both focusing on New York previously for me and still for you, as well as, sort of your more international portfolio, right? That law wasn't written contemplating the large geospatial data sets that we have. And it's been up to agencies and their lawyers to sort of reinterpret that and still think about privacy and think about how to protect that through aggregation, through obscuring some info, but also to, hold themselves to the laws like the open data law in New York City, which requires agencies to publish data. So I think now that I'm at Populous, so just so everyone knows, I used to work for the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York City. So dealt with the issues on the other side from the government side, but now at Populous, so we're a third-party data platform. And so as a third party, every state freedom of information law is a little bit different. Some compel the agencies to disclose everything without thinking about redaction, without thinking about aggregation. So I think for many cities, they see the value in having us as a third party because as the third party, we're not under those same laws, and we give the city a little bit more latitude. So what we do for cities is really aggregate and provide the information they're looking for. And through our data use agreements with them, we'll share the data with anyone they want to, right? If they want to take some of that data and publish it publicly, they can do that. Often, as Robert mentioned, right, like many cities will say, we want to work with this university and we want to grant them access. And so we worry about, the data management issues, right, of keeping the data safe, keeping it secure, maintaining controls on who has access to it and what they can do with it. I think this is really important as we also have some cities we're working with in Europe, which I think is pretty far ahead of the US in terms of data privacy laws. So being compliant with things like GDPR in Europe. But, I think we're going to see, California last year passed the California Consumer Protection Act, which is kind of like GDPR, but for the state of California. And I think we're going to see more states like New York, take the same approach and think it's going to, I think in some ways, restrict agencies' ability to gather data, which is extremely useful for planning. And really, I think, accelerate some of the strategies for, keeping sort of the private information out of the data, but keeping the insights as well because we need them.
Great, thank you for that. In the chat pod, I wanted to make sure that we covered a couple of these. David, who's going to talk a little bit later about the paper review process, asked, is there a research question about maturing or scaling data or knowledge pools for mobility and equity? And that's sort of right in line with where our agenda is going after this session. But do either of you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, David, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by maturing, but like scaling up some of the learnings. I think like FTA Sandbox and others, have, there's lessons learned there. There's knowledge that, from those pilots and others. And, some see and all the other, organizations doing this great work. We personally think that there's still scope to further, massage that data, those knowledge bases to get insights out. And that's what we're trying to stand up, something like that. So I don't know if that answers the question, David, but the research question, is it actionable? Like, can we take those insights into operationally, stand up programs and services that speak to them? I think that's that's still yet to be seen, I think. Or maybe FTA knows if people are really learning from the pilots.
Right, right. Any thoughts, Rodney?
Yeah, I'll add a few. I think, with data standards that have been adopted, for better or for worse, because there's arguments around whether those standards get all the data that cities are looking for. I think what has been really helpful is the ability of companies like ours to offer solutions at scale, kind of getting back to like mid-sized small cities, giving them tools that, they maybe can't afford to earmark money for additional staff to, figure out how to get data and how to analyze it. And especially now with revenues dropping, I think what the other benefit of those standards, and I think where we see a lot of value, is that cities can cross-compare between each other, right? And researchers can look and compare cities because they're looking at a similar data set. So I think work along those lines has, I think, been super useful. And then I'll just add one of the things that we, our approach is, yes, the mobility data that shows you the trip making is really important, but there's some stuff that you're just not going to get out of that data. So surveys are super important tools and will continue to be, and especially for issues around equity.
That's great. Thank you for that. And we've got time for one more question. Andre, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. Rodney, Robert, thank you both for those presentations. And Rodney, I'm glad that we get to interact in a non-arguing about regulation context here, which is nice.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, my question was about, I guess, sort of a two-part thing. Robert, you kind of touched on this and had that, really compelling example of a man from Michigan, that sometimes there's, we have places in California that are so focused on reducing VMT at the moment, but sometimes there are some trips that are good new trips. We'll take more VMT so that guy doesn't have to walk 21 miles. So I'm curious about how we balance that. And then just for either of you, I was curious, I've been thinking more about, we don't have very strong performance metrics in the transit space in terms of how funding is allocated. And when we do have them, they tend to definitely not be the right ones in my opinion. They sort of focus on miles traveled or things like that. How do we on the equity front or access to opportunities, I'm just curious if you guys have put into thought into how do we actually translate that into potential performance metrics that then funding is based on that, sort of how you are actually, and it's a tough question, it's a big question, but just curious if you guys had any initial thoughts on that, because it's certainly something I'm trying to think about, and it's hard.
Rodney, I can go. I'm into this outcomes, the marginal benefit of trips. And again, I'm in this social services space. The amount of money that goes into social services is gigantic, but they don't pay a lot of attention to if anyone can actually get to the actual service. So a performance metric can be related to the impact on those social services that are stood up and the uptake and the effectiveness. So that could be a measure that could tie to funding of those particular programs, for example, for transit. So that's kind of where my mind has been so far, increasing the scope for the stakeholders and then tying the funding to impact on those external organizations.
I'll add a couple of thoughts of just what we've seen from micromobility in the last 2 years. I think, a lot of cities really wanted equity components, and sort of the first pass at that was, I think, what we saw various versions of put some amount of scooters in this area that we know is an equity area that we care about, that either suffered from redlining and now continues because of that structural racism that persists. And, it was a way to say to companies, you can't just dump all your assets into the downtown. This is supposed to be for everyone. I think what we're going to see is more of an evolution of that, because that's really measuring opportunity and not outcome. And I think, and this gets back to wanting to look at surveys, but this is another place where you can complement it with the mobility data itself is you want to reduce people's travel time, you want to increase their access to, you know, any number of things, whether that's, you know, the social services that they may be accessing or just recreation jobs, right? I think what was really interesting when I was working for the city in New York is it's a huge bureaucracy, and we were very focused on regulating like taxis and for hire in this small little, you know, realm. But then we worked with folks like at the Department of City Planning who cared about transportation and how people can access jobs with transportation. And I think you have to take that holistic approach. And I think, you know, one of the other benefits of potentially, you know, having a third party take some of this data and make sense of it is that you can more easily share it among yourselves and the government. I think we struggled a lot with how to figure out how to safely share data with our peers in government and regional agencies, right, who are going to take that information and look at it through a very different lens.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, one last question, because we're running a bit behind schedule now. Scott, you had a couple of questions in the chat pod. If you want me to read them, I'm happy to do that.
Sure, or I could just ask it to both presenters here. And it's tied to mobility, equity, planning and policy, but it's specifically related to what's happening in Los Angeles right now. I mean, that's the elephant in the room right now is Uber and ACLU against LADOT and MDS here. So I guess my question to both of you is related to that. How can that be used as a tool for either good or evil? And there's two sides of the coin here. I mean, it's very philosophical. I mean, I see both sides of the argument here, and I'm really trying to wrap my head around to really deep dive into MDS, the agency API, the mandate of sharing of real-time trips. I'm struggling with it. I really haven't. I've been following this for like 2 years now. So just trying to understand how LADOT can either require or mandate that. What is their use case for demonstrating policy and planning for mobility equity and for post-COVID recovery with different intermodal mobility solutions? Or on the other side of the coin, basically, what are the protections in place for cities that kind of opt in, either if they are part of the Open Mobility Foundation or not, in the absence of GDPR? Because really, in the United States, we wouldn't be having these lawsuits between Uber and ACLU against the city of LA if we had GDPR in place in the first place. So maybe first to Rodney, and then to Robert, you know, in University of Michigan. I want to get your take on this because I haven't heard this today, and I think data protection and privacy in light of MDS is really important. And I think it's front and center in this whole, you know, COVID dialogue and discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question and something I've definitely been following for as long.
I'm sure you have, yeah. And it gives me a lot of heartburn, really, because I see both sides of it, to be honest.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I'm really interested to see where the case goes, but I think you bring up a really good point. There isn't a federal, you know, data protection law, and we're not likely to see one in this Congress. So instead, we're going to see states kind of piecemeal adopting their own versions of what California has adopted. And I think it's just now, right, the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection or Privacy Act, I don't remember which, has been in place since January, but I think just now are people bringing lawsuits again, you know, under that law.
Yeah,
you know, this is one of those. They also mention the California Electronic Communications Act, which actually the California Legislative Council says really should bar cities from collecting on-trip data from scooter users. So I'm curious to see how the court rules here, but I'm also kind of scared because I just, you know, not to neg the courts, but I just don't. these really nitty gritty data and privacy, questions being heard and sort of decided by courts across the country is terrifying to me, just because, there's the piecemeal legislation that could really make it really difficult to even have a data standard. And I think piecemeal lawsuits under those statutes is going to similarly do that. So I just think there's been a lot of value in having a data standard, especially for, as I said, small and mid-sized cities who, either wouldn't have the leverage on their own to command that data, or wouldn't have the resources to manage the collection and analysis of that data. So I worry on their behalf. But I'll also say, I haven't seen a great articulation of the use case for the real-time data. And so I think that's going to be key to this court decision. So I don't know where they're going to go with it, honestly, but definitely have my eyes on it as well.
All right, thank you. Yeah, maybe Robert, if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah,
too.
From the research standpoint, we have a couple partners on our project, Future of Privacy Forum, and we've been in close communication with OMF as well about this. And I think it's tough. We're not lawyers. We have lots of lawyers here at the university, of course, to do these data agreements. But one principle is, learning from the biomedical field in HIPAA, right? And this is something that they've been through and work on. There are consortia of, say, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals. All your electronic medical records in some ways are available through various consortia that are restricted use, that serve the public good, I believe, in generating new medical interventions. So maybe the medical field is a place that we should, pay closer attention to, probably. And then the other is the use case for opt-in. Opt-in. If I'm a user and it's my data, the city, and the case is there, the city needs to make a case to me the opt-in to make that data available, be even real time for planning purposes. And so,
yeah, to allow the consumer to have that choice ahead of time, so that they're
maybe there's a space. Maybe there's some middle ground there for opt-in features as well. So that's, I think where we are on that. It's a huge topic with lots of lawyers and civic organizations involved. So that's my take.
All right. Well, thank you both. That was really helpful. I appreciate your comments.
And thank you both for excellent presentations, and I appreciate all the discussion as well.